Okay, so let's jump right in. When you think of the United Kingdom, what comes to mind? Probably a wealthy, developed nation, right? But behind that image, there's a really surprising story about food that most people don't see. Today, we're going to look at the data on food security, and honestly, some of these numbers are pretty shocking. So let's start with a question for you. In a country like the UK, just how many people do you think are struggling to get enough food to eat? I mean, really struggling. Just take a second, think of a number in your head. I have a feeling the reality we're about to unpack might be a lot different than what you're guessing. Now, before we get to those numbers, it's super important we're all clear on what food security actually means. It's not just about having some food to avoid starvation. No, it's about having reliable and consistent access to enough good, nutritious food. You know, the kind you need to live a healthy, active life. It's all about stability and quality, not just quantity. Right, so with that in mind, let's get into the first part of our explainer. What is the actual scale of this problem across the United Kingdom? Okay, so you look at this, and at first glance, you might think, well, 90% of households are food secure. That sounds pretty good, doesn't it? But here's the catch. That other slice, that 10%, represents millions upon millions of households. And here's the really critical part. This 90% figure is actually a drop from 92% back in 2020, so the trend is going in the wrong direction. So what does that 10% actually mean in real life, for real people? It's not just a percentage. Research from the Food Foundation estimates this translates to a staggering 9.9 million people. Let that sink in. Nearly 10 million individuals, that's 7.2 million adults and 2.7 million children, living with the daily uncertainty of where their next meal is coming from. So we've got this massive number, 9.9 million. But here's the thing. This burden isn't shared equally across the population. Not at all. In this next section, we're going to dig into the data to see exactly which groups are most at risk. And just take a look at this. The gap is absolutely stark. Only 84% of households with a disabled person are food secure, compared to 94% of households without. So what this tells us is that having a disability or just living with someone who does dramatically increases your risk of facing food insecurity. This is often because of higher living costs and other barriers. And we see a really similar and frankly deeply concerning pattern right here. Households with children are significantly more likely to be food insecure than households without. And other data shows that for single-parent households, the risk is even greater. It just highlights this profound vulnerability for so many families across the country. And it's not just about who you are. It's also about where you live. This problem isn't spread out evenly. Food insecurity is far more concentrated in certain regions, like the Northwest, the Northeast, Yorkshire and the Humber, and the West Midlands, which really points to some deep-seated economic disparities. Okay, so we've looked at the what, the who, and the where. Now for the most complex question of all. Why is this happening? Let's get into the key drivers that are fueling this crisis. At the very heart of this is the cost of living crisis. I mean, food and energy prices have just skyrocketed, squeezing everyone's budgets. This is made so much worse by social support systems and benefits that just aren't keeping pace. And then, as we just saw in the data, all these pressures get amplified for people with disabilities who face higher costs, and for people living in regions with weaker economies. You know, this quote from the Trussell Trust, which runs a huge network of UK food banks, is just incredibly powerful. It says that even when we hear good news about the economy, like inflation falling, it isn't translating into any relief for the people who are struggling the most. For a lot of them, the hardship is actually getting worse. And on top of those core issues, you've basically got a perfect storm of other factors. Think about it. The long-term effects of the pandemic, ongoing global supply chain chaos, and new constraints on trade and labor. It's all added layers and layers of pressure, making our entire food system more fragile and more expensive. So yeah, it's a complex and pretty daunting picture, but it is not without hope. Let's move into our final section and take a look at what is being done and what the experts recommend for a path forward. Right now, the response is happening on two main fronts. On the one hand, you have the government, which is officially monitoring the situation and has to report on food security every 3 years. On the other hand, you have civil society, charities and food banks, and they are on the front lines every single day, providing the emergency aid that millions now depend on to get by. But to solve this for the long term, reports are clear that a much bigger, more comprehensive approach is needed. This means strengthening the social safety net so it actually covers the true cost of living. It means giving targeted support to those vulnerable groups we identified earlier. And it means building more resilient local food systems. It's really about moving away from emergency aid and towards systemic prevention.
And all of that brings us to our final thought. After seeing the scale of this problem and the potential solutions, we're left with a really fundamental question. For a country like the UK, is the challenge of making sure every single person has enough good food to eat really a matter of resources, or is it a matter of priority? Something to think about.